Well, tensions are escalating over the Ukraine for really two reasons, a long-term one and a more short-term one. The long-term reason is an incredibly foolish and misguided policy by the Western Alliance, by NATO, the United States and the EU towards Ukraine over the last decade or so. What we've seen is, first of all, an expansion of NATO, breaking agreements made with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, right up to the borders of both Belarus and Ukraine. And Russia perceives that the next step is to have Ukraine, or maybe also Georgia in the Caucasus, join NATO, which several people would like to do. They would see this as a serious threat to their vital security interests, so that is an obvious cause of tension. In addition, a few years ago, the West was seen by Russia, rightly or wrongly, as supporting a popular uprising, if you like, in the Ukraine, which overthrew a highly corrupt but nonetheless democratically legitimate government and put in its place a government which the Russians regard as being against their interests. So there's a long-run Western policy which has had the effect of seriously upsetting and annoying the Russians. And this is incredibly short-sighted. You do not, to use a metaphor, poke a bear in the eye with a blunt stick unless you have a gun and you are able and prepared to use it. And in this case, the West has been provoking the Russians without actually having the wherewithal or the willingness to back up the kind of policy that they're following. So that's the long-term reason for the tension. The reason why it has suddenly escalated last year and this year is for two reasons, really. The first is the perception in Russia and elsewhere following the mishandled American withdrawal from Afghanistan that the United States has its hands full with problems elsewhere, with its internal politics, and that it's not in a position to actually do anything effective in Europe. The other is the shift that has taken place in the geopolitical orientation and global economic orientation of China in the last 2 years. Had there been a showdown between Russia and the West over Ukraine, say 4 or 5 years ago, the Chinese would have stood to one side and would not have supported Russia because their economic interests at the time, the very close economic connections they had with the United States, meant that they would stand to lose more than they would gain. Now, however, Xi Jinping has clearly indicated that the Chinese People's Republic is looking to extricate itself, if you will, or weaken that kind of strategic economic relationship. And almost certainly now, if there is a showdown between Russia and the West in Ukraine, China will lean strongly towards the Russian side, and that gives the Russians much more room for maneuver. So you have a combination of a completely misguided long-term Western policy, which has provoked a very hostile Russian reaction over the years, and a sudden perceived or actual weakening in the Western position, which has led Putin to the perception that this is his opportunity to gain a major diplomatic victory, one that will also strengthen his internal political position. Not that he needs it much, but it certainly would face off his critics from the ultra-nationalist right in Russia. Well, it's not so much that Russia has a historic claim to Ukraine, it's more that it has a historic and very close connection. But the problem, and this is actually the cause of a lot of the problems we have here, is that connection, if you will, is only to part of the territory in the state of Ukraine. You have to realize that Ukraine has only existed in its present boundaries since the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939. The western part of Ukraine, places like Podolia, Vladimir, Galicia, they were historically never, ever part of Russia or any Russian state until 1939. Historically, they were part of the Habsburg Empire, or before then, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That part of Ukraine is not even Orthodox Christian. It has its own church, the Uniate Church, which is in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. It's always been oriented towards the West and part of Western Catholic Europe rather than Eastern Orthodox, or if you like, Byzantine Europe. Meanwhile, the eastern part of Ukraine, and in particular the Donbass, the two provinces where the fighting is going on, has historically always been part of mainstream Russia. And it was only put into the Ukraine when the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was created by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Civil War. Now, historic Ukraine is the bit in the middle around Kiev. Now, there are very, very close connections with Russia and that part of Ukraine, because that area is the actual historic heartland of Russian culture and the Orthodox Church. In fact, the Kievan state in the early Middle Ages was known as Rus, and that's where the word Russian actually comes from. So there's an immensely close historic connection between the greater Russian state, based around Moscow, and that part of Eurasia, the area around Kiev, going back for hundreds of years. That said, there's a distinct Ukrainian nationality, which has been a self-aware, distinct nationality for a very long time. So it's not that the current Russian government wants to annex Ukraine or has a territorial claim. What they're saying is that Ukraine is an area of central historical and symbolic importance for Russia, but also that it's an area of vital strategic interest to them, which is undoubtedly true. It's not that much of a strategic interest for the EU. This is part of the problem at the moment. What we have here, in the case of this crisis that's emerging over Ukraine, is a serious imbalance in terms of the importance attached to Ukraine by the two sides. For any Russian government, and I emphasize any here, this isn't just about Vladimir Putin, Ukraine, the central part of the Ukrainian territory in particular, and also the Black Sea littoral, is an area of vital strategic importance because it gives you access to the Black Sea, which is of huge strategic importance for Russia. And also, it is historically one of the major routes through which Russia has been invaded from the West by a whole succession of Western powers. Sweden, for example, also the Germans in more recent history. So they do not, under any circumstances, want that part of the Great Eurasian Plain to fall under the control of what they see as a hostile power. And so they see the prospect of it joining NATO, for example, as a huge threat to their vital strategic interests, in the same way that the United States saw the prospect of Cuba becoming a Soviet satellite with Russian missiles in it as a threat to their vital strategic interests. Now, by contrast, Europe does have an interest in the Ukraine, but first of all, it's not as big or as critical as it was, let's say, 100 years ago, when Ukraine was a vital source of both grain and oil for Western powers, Germany in particular. And in terms of its geopolitical or geostrategic location, its geographical location, it's not really that important to Europe at all. So what we have here is a dispute over an area which is of vital strategic interest for Russia, but not that important strategic interest for Western Europe. Certainly not compared to the, I would say, overriding importance of not having utterly bad relations with Russia, regardless of what else you may think about the current regime in power there. And so you've got a fundamental imbalance of interest, and that is always a bad place to be in if you have a crisis, because what it means is that the sides for whom this is a vital interest are always going to be prepared and willing to go further than the side for whom it's not a vital interest. It's like playing poker when you've only got a pair of twos and the other person has a full house. You don't want to get in that position. My own guess at the moment is that the chances of a Russian invasion are about 50%. I think that Putin and the Russian leadership do not want to have an invasion. If they can get their strategic ends realized without having an invasion, and all the consequences that that would bring, they would much rather do it. These are rational political actors. They don't want to face the kind of economic and other consequences that the invasion would bring in its train. But they perceive this as being an opportunity, a window of opportunity to realize certain goals, like getting Ukraine permanently excluded from ever joining NATO or joining the EU, and also therefore restricting Western strategic interests in that part of the world. And they fear that this opportunity may not may not last that long or may not recur. And so I think that if they feel that the only way they can get what they want is to invade, then they will. And they've certainly got the wherewithal. And I think that strategically, the really alarming sign is the movement of Russian troops and Belarusian troops to the Belarusian border, because that means they're poised to strike down the Don River towards Kiev, right into the heart of Ukraine. And they're also, of course, in the position to roll straight across eastern Ukraine into the two provinces that are already in the control of pro-Russian separatists, and beyond that into the eastern half of Ukraine. So I think I would say that there's about a 50% chance of that happening right now. What would the consequences be? Well, one of the things to say is that we, by which I mean NATO, the West more generally, have got ourselves into a truly terrible position because, quite honestly, we are not in a position to fight a war over Ukraine. Quite a few of the major NATO members, not least Germany, which is completely dependent on Russian gas for a large part of its energy supplies, are prepared to fight a shooting war with Russia. And also, even from the American point of view, fighting a shooting war with Russia is not something you want to do lightly. It's a nuclear power, after all. So I think on the Western side, we're not really prepared to fight a shooting war over this, and the Russians know that. On the other hand, there are all sorts of other, if you like, instruments in the West's locker that would be used against Putin. We can, for example, impose very stringent and severe economic sanctions on the Russian state. We could do things like barring Russia from access to the SWIFT international payments system, which would have a massively disruptive effect upon Russian business, the Russian economy, and not least the Russian elite, who would not be able to move their money around the world. There are all kinds of things that we could do like that, which would hurt the Russians severely. I think the thing, though, is that if push comes to shove, the Russian elite are prepared to take that kind of hit, but they would prefer to avoid it if they can. That's a very good question. It's a very good question as to whether or not the institutions that we've got at the moment, the international rule-based order, if you like, can cope with this. Because in many ways, this is a kind of reversion to the sort of international crisis that was commonplace in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century up until the end of World War II. It's a territorial stroke geopolitical dispute of a kind which anyone who studied the history of diplomatic relations will be familiar with. Can the institutions cope with it? They should be able to cope with it. The problem is that they are only going to be able to cope with a crisis like this if policy is conducted on the basis of foreign policy realism. And for too long now, mainly because of the orientation of the United States, international institutions have been working on a different basis, one of what I would call idealistic legalism, in which the idea is that international law is what really matters, and that it's all a question of what is consonant or in agreement with international law. You can ignore the kind of geopolitical realities and the realities of brute force. Now, personally, I think that's a ultimately nonsensical view. To quote Thomas Hobbes, covenants without the sword are but words. Ultimately, all international relations is based upon force and power. You hope that that force and power will be conducted and used within a framework of rules, but it ultimately rests upon that. And so what's happened at the moment is that a set of international institutions which are designed to deal with crises like this in a way that defuses them so that great power confrontations do not happen, is not working as it should do because of the way in which those institutions are increasingly being used and driven by a completely unrealistic idea of how international relations works. Well, there's two parts to that question. One is to do with the current crisis or standoff, if you will. The other is the longer term question of what to do about Russia, and indeed not just Russia, but the Caucasus and places like Belarus and Ukraine as well. In terms of the short-term crisis, the liberal response is the same response that anybody would have from any political position, which is that really you want to avoid an armed conflict at almost any cost, because the consequences would be simply catastrophic. Leaving aside the fact that this is a war potentially with a nuclear power, which is really scary, people who glibly talk about how we need to use force have no idea of what even a conventional war between two modern armies in Europe would be like. The consequences, which would be not just large-scale and extremely violent conflict, but also massive disruption through irregular warfare, cyber disruption and the like, hardly bear thinking about. So one liberal goal, in common with almost any ideology actually, is simply to find some way of avoiding this becoming a shooting war. And I think that the thing to do here is to make it very clear and explicit that there is no prospect in the near future of Ukraine being allowed to join NATO or the EU. But at the same time, to insist that Russia does not have a veto over NATO membership, that the Russians might be prepared to accept that. And secondly, to actually give effect to the agreement that has already been negotiated some years ago between the West and Russia over Ukraine, the Minsk II agreement, so-called, which is being held up at the moment by the obstinacy and obstructiveness of the Ukrainian government, because they're not prepared to accept one of the key elements of the Minsk II agreement, which is amending the Ukrainian constitution to turn Ukraine into a federal republic with significant autonomy for the Donbass region, the region where the fighting is going on. The Russians have said that they're not prepared to withdraw from those disputed provinces or stop supporting the separatists in those provinces until that kind of constitutional amendment has been made. And the Ukrainian government is refusing to do that. Now, I think basically the Ukrainian government should be told that they have to go along with this, and that should be put into effect. So that, I think, is what not just classical liberal principles, but common sense suggests should be done to deal with the immediate pressure. The deeper question is how to approach Russia and Vladimir Putin. And there are two things to say here. The first is that Putin is a despot. He is not a nice man. He is also a systematic enemy of liberal democracy. The Russian state is following a whole series of covert policies and covert actions which are deliberately designed to undermine Western liberal democratic political orders. So he is a serious threat. But you have to say, and it's worth bearing this in mind, in Russian political terms, he's actually a moderate. There are many people in Russia, and a very large part of the Russian population, which is more aggressively nationalist and anti-Western than he is. He is actually more of a moderate. So given that, and given the kind of threat that this sort of authoritarian kleptocracy, which is what Russia is now, poses to liberal principles, what should we do? And I think the answer is we should not seek to bring about regime change through some kind of overt operation, whether military or through the kind of fancy tricks that the CIA and other agencies get up to. But what we should do is to support civil society in Russia and the many groups who are opposed to Putin and to the current regime, as I say, an authoritarian kleptocracy. There are people like that, people who, like Navalny, the man who Putin recently tried to have assassinated by all accounts, Vladimir Khodorkovsky, former oil magnate who is another leading opposition figure. We should be supporting people like that, and we should be working not through governments, but at a civil society level to support opposition movements within Russia. This is a long-term project, if you will, but that's the way to go forward. And also, not just in Russia, we should be supporting similar activities in both Belarus, which is now quite clearly a Russian client state, and Ukraine, which is basically a failed state and also another kleptocracy. So in all these parts of Europe, we should be looking to build up democratic and liberal civil society movements in the hope that ultimately this will lead to a replacement of the current political system in Russia. And in the meantime, what you want to have is cool and correct, but not hostile relations, because you're on the same part of the Eurasian landmass. You do not want to be in a situation of having a complete, confrontational standoff between that part of Eurasia and the West, which is what we've got at the moment.